Welcome to the Blank Space podcast brought to you by Lily Wharton and Sean Davies. This is our first episode of Blank Space, where today we'll be discussing different moon landing conspiracies and ultimately disproving why they're phony. We chose this topic for our first episode not only because we find the moon landing itself to be fascinating, but we find the fact that these conspiracies are still flying around almost 60 years later despite being proven as false. So Lily's going to go over our first reason of why the moon landing is a hoax, and she's going to disprove it and talk about it a little bit. So Lily, take it away.
So, one of the most common arguments from the moon landing conspiracists, and perhaps the easiest to disprove, is their claim that the moon landing was faked because there are no stars seen in the pictures taken on the moon. Their thinking behind this is that the sky is black, so of course, why wouldn't we see stars in these pictures? The science behind this theory examines the atmosphere. Think about how we see stars from the surface of the Earth. Our atmosphere is so thick that it scatters the faint light produced by those stars during the day, making those stars only visible at night. This is different on the moon. The moon's atmosphere is airless, meaning there's no atmosphere to scatter the light produced by stars. Therefore, those stars from the moon are visible at any time, and that logic makes us think that, of course, we should see them in photos at day or night. However, just since these stars are always visible, that doesn't mean they're going to show up in photographs, which is what our rebuttal addresses. When taking pictures on the surface of the moon, there was an overwhelming amount of light. An astronaut that was taking a photograph of his colleague had to account for the illumination of the lunar landscape from the sunlight, as well as his colleague's bright white spacesuit. With two bright objects in the frame, the camera exposure had to be set very fast. But with the faint appearing stars, these camera settings didn't pick up their luminosity, and those stars didn't register on film.
Thank you, Lily, for that. Very interesting, very interesting. Now moving on to probably my favorite conspiracy because of just how crazy it is. A lot of people said that the moon landing is fake because you can't see the flag that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong planted on the moon flapping in the wind. And there's lots of speculation that the moon landing is fake because the flag was seen flapping in the wind. However, there's no wind on the moon, so how is that possible? Now, when I say that there's no air in space, we're not negating weather in space, but wind needs air, and there's no air in the vacuum of space, so that wouldn't be possible. So people were confused on why the flag was flapping around, flying. It looked like it was flailing in the wind. But this doesn't include solar wind, which is a stream of charged particles released from the upper atmosphere of the sun. It can affect spacecraft and space travel, but it's not wind in the traditional sense, so that's not what we're talking about here. But anyway, the reason the flag looked to be flapping is because it wasn't a regular flag. If the astronauts were to bring a normal flag on the moon, it would slack and droop like a flag would on Earth. It would just kind of not look flowing at all. It would just kind of hang and drape. But instead, the flag that was brought to the moon had horizontal rods that held the flag upright. And when the astronauts would try to extend and set up these rods, it would give the flag an appearance that it was flowing. But the Apollo 11 astronauts had trouble extending the rods all the way, which is why the flag had that kind of ripple effect. And when they were touching it, you could see from the videos, it did look like it was moving and it did have that ripple effect. But once they would step away from the flag, it would sit still with no flowing manner to it. So yeah, I think that's my personal favorite one because that's pretty crazy. And I could see why people would say that, why is the flag waving? There's no wind in space. But anyway, Lily's going to move on and talk about the shadow conspiracies regarding the moon landing. So I'm going to give it over back to Lily.
Thanks, Sean. That's actually really interesting. I could see why people would believe that, but it seems if you were to do the bare minimum research, you would quickly find out that it was a technical problem with the flag instead of the wind blowing it. Anyways, moving on to the two major theories that regard shadows in the pictures on the moon. One talks about the direction that shadows cast in, and the other talks about the color. So the first argument claims that the shadows we see in pictures taken on the moon should be parallel. They claim that the images are fake because there should only be one true source of light on the moon, which would be the sun. Since there should only be one apparent source of light, the shadows created should all appear parallel. To debunk this theory, think about the role that distance plays in the relationship between a light source and the shadow it creates. So when a light source is extremely close to an object, it wouldn't cast parallel shadows. This remains the same for objects that are extremely far away from the light source as well. And I think the 150 million kilometers between the sun and the moon meets that qualification. So due to this far distance, the perspective from where the pictures are being taken and observed from becomes very important. So, as an example, when the sun is low in the sky, the length of these shadows will increase, and when this is combined with a long distance between the objects casting the shadows, distortion can occur, and the viewing perspective becomes limited. So the shadows of a nearby object compared to a faraway object would appear to diverge when photographed from eye level, yet if we looked at them from directly above, they would still appear to be parallel to one another. So, in addition, another claim considering shadows states that the pictures from the moon landing must be fake because all the shadows are not pitch black. Again, considering that the sun should be the only source of light and the moon has no atmospheric composition to scatter this light, the shadows should appear completely black. Yet in some pictures taken on the surface of the moon, objects can still be seen despite being in the path of a shadow. But as I discussed earlier when I debunked the lack of stars in pictures, it's necessary to account for the brightness of the lunar landscape of the moon itself. The moon has a thin layer of lunar dust covering its surface that has a special reflective property that tends to reflect light right back to its direct source. So, in the pictures taken on the moon, the sun could be off to the left, which would shine light on an object, let's say the moon lander. It would illuminate its left side, and the shadow, of course, would fall, casted off in the right. But when the light from the sun reaches that layer of lunar dust on the surface of the moon, the light is reflected right back up onto the back of that moon lander. So, in addition to illuminating the left side of the moon lander, the sunlight is reflected off the surface of the moon and could potentially illuminate sections of the moon lander that would presumably only appear black. The reflection of sunlight off the lunar dust causes shade discrepancies in the shadows on the moon, so it makes sense that not all shadows on the moon's surface would appear to be fully black in photographs. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Sean, who's going to talk about the political reasoning and the context of the space race in the Vietnam War.
Thank you, Lily. I really appreciate that. For our political reasons, I'm going to be talking about the space race and the Vietnam War and the conspiracies that many people have behind them. So I'm a huge history buff, so for me, this is actually really interesting. Anyway, I'm going to give a quick background on the space race. So basically, it was between the two Cold War rivals, the United States and the Soviet Union, in a battle to achieve ultimate space travel capabilities. This took place from around 1957 to 1969. It was a large part of the Cold War, and it spanned from the end of. It was a large part of the Cold War, which spanned from the end of World War II and until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And then I'm going to go over some just like major timeline points of the space race. So in 1957 was probably what many would say to be the first major event of the space race, which was when the Soviets launched their first artificial satellite into space, which was Sputnik. And then about a month later, the Soviets sent the first animal to space. It was a dog named Laika in the launch of Sputnik 2. So it's actually really sad because the technology to reorbit was not fully developed yet, and Laika tragically overheated and died. So not a big fan of that one as a dog fan. But anyway, moving on to 1961, the Soviets then launched the first human into space, which I'll talk more on that later. And then in 1962, John Glenn became the first American in space. And then ultimately the space race ended with the Americans in 1969 and the Apollo 11 mission reaching the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. So anyway, conspiracy comes into this on the moon landing because many believe that NASA faked the moon landings to avoid humiliation in losing to the Soviets and to continue funding their program. This is a notorious conspiracy theorist and author, Bill Kaysing, stated in many of his books that NASA raised over $30 billion to pay off their staff as hush money instead of the earnings being used for what they were advertised to do, which was to go to the moon. And then Kaysing titled his theory as Americans' $30 billion swindle, which is really interesting. But Kaysing was then to be disproved by many. Phil Plait was one. He disproves the specific theory, and any that have the Americans faking the moon landing as the Soviets would have cried foul, as Plait puts it, if the Americans were to fake the landings, especially because the Soviets' own program failed in many ways on their path to getting towards the moon. So instead, Plait explains that a legitimate hoax would have proven to be a massive propaganda tactic for the Soviets to use against the Americans, and instead of using that to their advantage, which if it was fake, they should have ultimately done, they reluctantly acknowledged that these landings and statements from Neil Armstrong surrounding the landings were factual in the third edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. I say reductantly because they list the moon landings as the third greatest achievement during the space race following the launch of Sputnik, and as I mentioned before, the first human flight in space, which is Yuri Gagarin. And then a little bit about the Vietnam War. In 2009, the American Patriot Friends Network claimed that the landings helped the United States government distract public attention from the unpopular Vietnam War at the time. And so crewed landings suddenly ended about the same time that the United States ended its involvement in the war. And then this was ultimately disproven because, in fact, the ending of the landings was not sudden, and the war was one of several federal budget items with which NASA had to compete with. And if we want to talk about NASA's budget, you can look at the stats. Their budget peaked in 1966 and fell by 42% by 1972. This was the reason the final flights were cut, along with plans for even more ambitious follow-on programs such as a permanent space station and crewed flight to Mars. So it doesn't really add up why the government would overlook or use the Vietnam War as a way to kind of cover up the moon landings. The timelines don't really match up in the years that were mentioned. So yeah, I think that's it for us. That's going to be the end of our first episode, the Blank Space Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'm Sean Davies and my co-host Lily Wharton. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.